The familiar story of the people Israel begins while they are enslaved in Egypt. God observes the misery of his people and hears their cry. God delivers the Israelites through the ministry of the prophet Moses, who not only leads them out of Egypt, but leads them through the wilderness that lies beyond the Red Sea. In the wilderness, God protects his people, God instructs his people, and God disciplines his people for the life of freedom that lies ahead of them. The less familiar story of the people Israel begins where the first one leaves off. In the Promised Land, the Israelites try out a number of different forms of government. First the judges, and then the kings. The flawed humanity of Israel's leadership creates problems for them at every turn. Ultimately, their kingdom divides in two, and the two halves are conquered in course by the Babylonian Empire. 700 or 800 years after the Israelites arrive in the Promised Land, they find themselves once again held in bondage by a neighbor. The promise towards which their ancestors strived in the desert seems to have been just one more mirage, one more illusion, perhaps delusion, that God might actually provide some relief. The psalmist captures the mood. My mouth is dried out like a potsherd, my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You have laid me in the dust of the grave. Enter now the prophet Isaiah, called by God not in a burning bush, but with a burning coal that anoints his lips and purifies his speech. From the volume of hope that bears Isaiah's name, composed during the time of Israel's humiliation and separation, comes this morning's first reading. I am about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or even come to mind. So be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating, for I am about to create Jerusalem as a joy and its people as a delight. Through the words of the prophet Isaiah, God says, I'm about to take the house back to its studs. I'm about to rip the car down to its frame. My new creation will restore your joy and your hope. When you are in the place that I am building for you, these hard days of misery will fade from your memory. You will be like Eve and Adam, dwelling with me in a garden that sits on the bank of the river of life. As if this were not enough, Isaiah continues, no more shall the sound of weeping be heard in your land, or the cry of distress. No more shall there be an infant that lives but a few days, or an old person that does not live out a lifetime. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For like the days of a tree shall the days of my people be. For almost 3,000 years, Isaiah's words have offered hope to faithful people in challenging situations. The Israelites, for whom this message was written, lived in sorrow. They were in an unfamiliar place, separated from the land that was their birthright. They were beginning to forget what freedom was. Imagine how wonderful Isaiah's prophecy must have sounded to them. No more shall the sound of weeping be heard in your land, or the cry of distress. The disciples and the apostles in the first century Jerusalem lived in fear. They had seen the Son of God betrayed and arrested and led to slaughter on a hill outside of town. They knew that they would suffer the same fate if they were bold enough to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ in that sacred city. Imagine how wonderful Isaiah's message would have sounded to them. I am about to create Jerusalem as a joy, and its people as a delight. European Christians in the Middle Ages lived in anguish as the plague spread across Europe, killing indiscriminately. Mid-South Christians in the 19th century knew the same anguish as yellow fever snatched children out of their hands. Imagine how wonderful Isaiah's message would have sounded to them and to every other faithful person in every generation who has ministered in difficult circumstances. No more shall there be an infant that lives but a few days, or an old person who does not live out a lifetime. No more. At its core, today's first reading is God's promise that all suffering is temporary. As the psalmist puts it, weeping may spend the night, but joy comes in the morning. I wonder if God's promise in Isaiah might sound different to me if I did not live as comfortably as I do. I do not know the lonely sorrow of imprisonment or the stinging fear of political persecution. I do not know the anguish of not having a place to live or enough food to eat. Yet almost a decade of pastoral ministry experience has taught me that suffering is a universal experience. No matter how wealthy you are, there is a limit to what we can do. No matter how influential you are, there is a limit to what individuals and organizations can do. Money and power go a long way in our society, but they cannot go all the way. Suffering of both the visible and invisible varieties is a universal experience. And in that way, suffering is an equalizing experience. We all know what it feels like not to be able to control ourselves or our circumstances. And that experience can help us find compassion for others when they experience the same. God waits for each one of us just beyond the boundary of our strength, just beyond the boundary of what we can handle. Some of us reach that boundary more quickly than others, and some of us are more willing to admit it when we have reached the boundary. But the boundary exists for us all, and God waits for us in that most humbling place with ancient words of infinite love. Relief and release flow from the throne of God and from the words of the prophet Isaiah. I am about to create new heaven and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or even come to mind for you. So be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating for you. Once again, God has heard the cry of his people, and once again, God has responded. All we have to do is hold on to our hope. Amen.